As I was looking at the message for Noah, it just struck me as a little bit funny. And I know a lot of people don't think about God as having a sense of humor, or there's very much in the Bible that's funny. I think if we understand it from its original context, there is plenty of humor, especially in some of the Proverbs, plenty of humor in the Bible. But it struck me that as Moses was receiving this information from God, there had to have been a previous understanding on the part of the ancient Hebrews of their heritage, an oral tradition. But when Moses went up on Mount Sinai and God gave him the law, and the book of Genesis is included in that, the part of the law. It's not just the Numbers and Deuteronomy, but the first 5 books of the Old Testament. God inspires and instructs Moses to write this story of Noah and a flood to a group of people who are living in the wilderness, in the desert, and are constantly complaining about not having enough water. Feast or famine. Either, Noah's got too much, and the Hebrews don't have enough. That just struck me as humorous. That wasn't the point, though. The point of especially the book of Genesis is to answer 3 basic questions. As the Israelites come out of their exodus after spending 400 years in the environment, the context, the worldview of the Egyptians, they need to be reminded, they need to learn, who is our God? Who is this one going before us? Who is this one that Moses says has sent him? Who is this one, and what gives him the right to say that I am God and here is how you should worship me? Who is he? And another question, why are we here? What is our legacy? What gives us this special status to be rescued out of our slavery and put into this new promised land? And where are we going? What's the big future for us? We're not going to answer all of those questions. We are focusing primarily on trying to figure out who is our God. How do we relate to him? Because there are some things that have not changed since Noah was in the ark, since Moses wrote this story. 2 things have not changed. 1, the nature of God. It's the same God. And 2, the human condition. We are still needy of a relationship with our God. So this is the book of Genesis, is this orientation to God and to who these people were. And there are points of contact we share with them that help us understand the nature of God and the nature of our relationship with him. Now, when it comes to the flood story, Genesis 6-9, we're not going to look at every verse, every line in detail in those chapters. There's simply not time. But I do want to draw out some key central truths about God, how he reveals himself, what he is teaching the Hebrews through the experience and the narrative of Noah's life. We are not going to focus on whether or not there was a flood or if that's a myth. Let me just categorically say, I believe, it's presented in Scripture as a historical fact. It happened. Are we confused by it? Yes. Why are we confused by it? Because it was a supernatural event. So it's not going to follow all of the rules that we would expect it to follow. It's not like the Grand River overflowing its banks. Was it global or was it local? I think the text presents itself as being global. The whole earth was covered in water. Did it change the nature of God's created world? Yes, in ways we can't fully understand. But this is not written, Moses did not write this to create a scientific commentary on how there was a gap of something happening between the Garden of Eden and the Promised Land. It was written to create a theological bridge on how God's people who started in the garden, in perfect relationship with God, they walked with God. And that phrase is used of Noah intentionally. Just like Adam and Eve, he walked with God. But how did we get from walking with God to walking in the wilderness? And since we're walking in the wilderness, and I'm speaking of the Hebrews now, How do they relate to this God? And what do they understand about the dynamics of their relationship? And what does God expect of them? These are the theological truths that are taught in the story of the flood as a historical event. So I wish we could go through and look at this in great detail, but there are lots of people way smarter and better educated than me that have done this kind of work. So if you're fascinated by the flood, now not all authorities on the flood from a conservative historical perspective are equal. Some of them don't do a really good job, but there are lots of resources out there that talk about the dynamics of the hydraulics and how that could have affected tectonic plates and all that stuff. I don't know. That's fascinating for me to listen to, beyond my pay grade. I'm not a scientist. Remember what I said earlier. I'm not a numbers guy. I'm a words guy. So I can understand how this is given to us as a narrative, constructed and crafted together under the influence of the Holy Spirit by Moses to communicate to those Hebrews, who is your God and what is the nature of your relationship with him? So we're going to stand back a little bit, look at this story as theology. It was never intended to be science, although we can understand some scientific principles in it. It's given to us as theology to teach us now, the following generations, about our God. And the story breaks into 3 sections. One of my goals as a pastor, one of my passions, I can say, is not simply to download dogma week after week, but to model for you how to approach the Scriptures, how to study the Scriptures, so we can understand them as the original author intended and as the original audience received it. And the story of the flood needs to be understood in 3 distinct parts. There's a prologue, and then there's the main body of the story, and then there's an epilogue in which a summary commentary is made. And they form one single unit that drives to a central theme that we're going to see in chapter 8. Remember, especially in Old Testament stories, the theological punch is often in the middle of the story, not at the end. When we consider things like Aesop's fables and other teaching stories, you have to kind of get to the end and it's like, oh, that's what that means. In ancient Hebrew literature, that punch was often right there in the middle of the story. And that's true here in chapter 8 of Genesis. So I'm going to read selected parts of this story and then draw out the significance as it related to the Hebrews, because this is all on the context of how do we get from the garden, the perfect environment, to this moment of destruction where all of that is wiped out. And what does that mean for us now as we're wandering around the wilderness? Again, not us, the Hebrews. Let's not spiritualize this, that somehow we're the spiritual Hebrews. But as we put ourselves into their shoes, what were they learning? And then how do we extrapolate that truth into today for us? So let's start with the prologue. In chapter 6, verses 1 to 8. I'm going to read these verses and just make a few comments. The whole point of this prologue is to build a bridge with the garden and the things that were lost because sin entered the world. So there's a repetition. Some of the words and phrases that are used in this prologue come right out of that Garden of Eden story. Genesis chapter 6, verse 1. When men began to multiply on the face of the land, what did God say to Adam and Eve after he created them? Be fruitful and multiply. So they are doing exactly what they were told to do in the garden, and yet it's going wrong. When men began to multiply in the face of the earth, and daughters were born to them, and sons of God, so that daughters of men were attractive, they took as their wives any they choose. What did God say to Adam and Eve? That you're going to have children, and they should leave their mother and father and cleave to one another. That the idea of marriage is sourced in God, and yet something, we don't know what, The text does not give us enough details, but something was going wrong here. They took as their wives any they chose. And the Lord said, my spirit shall not abide in man forever, for he is flesh. His days shall be 120 years. There's a sense very clearly in the creation story where God breathes into Adam the breath of life. And now there's a limitation placed on that. His days shall be 120 years. And the Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward. We don't know who the Nephilim were. By the way, there's lots of theories out there. I think it's just a category, a social category by which people were known, perhaps people of great influence. But the Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also after them. And when the sons of God came into the daughters of men, they bore children to them. This is not a reference to angels. This is people. Word God there should be small g God, Elohim. It refers to anybody with political power or with economic power. So wealthy people or powerful people had children, and there was some kind of dysfunctional relationship, and they bore children. These were the mighty men who were of old, men of renown. And then verse 5, going all the way back to the garden. The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, because Adam and Eve had rebelled, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was evil continually. And in the Hebrew text, how Moses has written this, he takes the word evil and he places it at the very front. And sentence structure is a little bit different, but it would be evil, the Lord saw. And then it ends, that sentence, was evil, evil. It repeats a noun, an adjective, a noun that envelops this sentence. And the point is to stress that the human condition was absolute wickedness. Not just the individual, but within the culture and society. Everything that God had set up in the garden was broken and dysfunctional. And it was to the point, of what? Verse 6. And the Lord regretted that he had made man on the earth. There's a summary of creation. God made man and put him on the earth. And it grieved him to his heart. So the Lord said, I will blot out man, whom I have created from the face of the land, man and animals and creeping things and birds of the heavens. Where does that phrase come from? The days of creation. For I am sorry that I have made them. Let's do a quick little sidebar here. What in the world does it mean that God regretted creating and that his heart was broken and that he was going to, is he saying he made a bad choice? Well, obviously not. Again, put ourselves into the shoes of those original recipients. Where have they been for 400 years? They've been in an environment where they had some knowledge of God, but not a really clear, intimate knowledge of him. What they did understand really, really well were the gods of Egypt. And the multiple, my mind just switched into Spanish. I've got to put it back into English. The multiple gods that were worshipped in, just like in the Greek and Roman mythology, that polytheistic society. And they had this understanding that they were distant, disconnected, disembodied, self-centered, preoccupied with themselves beings that were powerful. You could not really know them. You could not engage with them. You could certainly never know what they wanted. You had to just kind of guess at it. And here, as there's a commentary on how the wickedness, the sin of Adam and Eve, has exponentially exploded, that the entire world is now dysfunctional in sin. God makes this comment, not a theological statement about his character. I made a mistake. No, he's revealing himself now as a personal God, that his heart is broken. He made this beautiful place, this garden, and he put within that the object of his love, Adam and Eve. He breathed into them life. And now because of their rebellion, that has gone crazy, viral. And God's heart is broken. This is a horrible situation. And these verses are packed with emotion that the Lord Yahweh regretted. His heart is just filled with sorrow, and he's grieved, and he's sorry that he has done this. Not because he made a bad choice, but because the sinfulness of those that he loves has so deeply touched him, because he still loves them in spite of their rebellion against him. This is a understanding in human terms. We might call it anthropomorphizing God, assigning human qualities to God to help us understand his nature and character, that in his infinite love, his heart breaks for those who violate the nature of his character, who violate what he intended from the very beginning, putting them into the garden. And this is the prologue. This is setting the stage for what's going to happen, that God is passionate and loving for his creation, and he sees how it's broken, and his heart breaks as we have rebelled against him and created this huge dysfunction of whatever it was. We don't know the nature of the sin that was happening here, but it's described as being wickedness, and every intention of our heart was only evil continually. It's a horrible scenario. And God's response to that, because he is a personal God, and by that I mean he is a person, a living being, the one and only, is a broken heart. It is not anger. It is not, I can't wait to get my revenge on them. Watch this. Zap, 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 zap. This is a God who's, in spite of the brokenness, loves his creation. And think now, what did Israel do over those 40 years? How many times did they rebel against God? How many times in the days of the judges did they rebel against God? How many times did they break his heart? They needed to know that even when you do that, his love for you is unbroken, because he is a God, a person, not a human, not a created being, but in his nature and character, his love overflows. And we saw that in Psalm 33. That's why I emphasized that one verse. Our God is righteous and just and full of unconditional love. Those concepts go together. Because God is righteous and just, he is also loving. And because he is loving, he is also righteous and just. We get offended at injustice in our society. We see a story on the news about maltreated animals or some children that are being abused, and we get angry and upset. We've got to take action. We cannot allow this to continue. How much more the God who created us? We want him to react against injustice and unrighteousness, except when I'm the one being unrighteous or unjust, and then I just kind of want God to wink at it and it's okay, Graham, that's really not a big deal. That's where the struggle is. Then we come to verse 8. Huge contrast. Just before we transition into the second part of the story, but Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. The entire world is a mess, but one man found favor, and his family, in the eyes of the Lord. So this is not a story about how did the flood happen. This is a story about how do we understand who our God is. So the prologue takes us up to chapter 6, verse 8, and now we come to the main story. And it's important that you look at this in verse 9 of Genesis chapter 6. As I've pointed this out before, the story of Genesis is told in chapters that do not follow the English chapter divisions, and each section starts with a phrase, something like, these are the generations of. That marks the beginning of the next series, the next cycle of stories. And in chapter 6, verse 9, it says, these are the generation of Noah. So we know now we are transitioning into a new part of the story. We've got the background. The world is broken. The beautiful garden has been perverted. Something's going to happen. And now we're going to hear the story of Noah. These are the generations of Noah. And again, there's a commentary about Noah. Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his generation. Noah walked with God. I love that phrase. It's perhaps the best definition of what does it mean to be a righteous person. It's not somebody who has attained spiritual elitism, who can perfectly and eloquently perform all the religious ceremonies and rituals, who has established a code of personal conduct and never breaks the rules. It is somebody who walks with God. And we're going to see Noah's got some foibles, but this is a great definition of what it is to be righteous, to walk with God. And again, who is Moses writing this to? A bunch of refugees living in tents out in the wilderness. And what is one of their frequent activities? They pack up their tents and they walk to the next location. This language is directed at them. When you pack up your tents and you're out there complaining, oh, isn't it hot? Oh, we got to eat manna again. Where there's not enough water, think about Noah. The man had too much water, not enough ventilation in his ark, I'm sure, and yet he walked with God. So when you're out there wandering around, Moses is saying, remember, you're walking with God. So we can't go through every detail of what happens here, but we're going to break down a little bit some of the bigger chunks of what happens in this flood story. There's a connection all the way back to Abraham. Now, Noah was before Abraham, but for the listeners wandering around the desert, there's a connection back to Abraham because Abraham too is described as a person who walked with God. There's an echo of the garden here in Genesis chapter 3. It says in the cool of the evening, God would come to the garden and he would walk with Adam and Eve. So this idea of walking is a significant one in communicating the essence of what it is to have a relationship with God, to have intimacy with God. In Deuteronomy chapter 31, when Moses has done his ministry, he's about to die, and God has said to him, pass the baton to Joshua, and the people are going to go into the promised land. Moses encourages the people, saying in chapter 31 of Deuteronomy, verse 6, be strong and courageous. Do not fear or be in dread of them, that is the inhabitants, for the Lord your God goes with you. He will not leave you or forsake you. And that word, the Lord your God goes with you, probably should have been translated, the Lord your God walks with you. In whatever you're doing, God is walking with you. He will not leave you or forsake you. So the narrative continues. There's a little bit more detail now in verses 11 and 12 about the nature, the condition of the earth. Back into Genesis, verse 11. Now the earth was corrupt in God's sight, and the earth was filled with violence, and God saw the earth, and behold, it was corrupt, for all the flesh had corrupted their way on the earth. And exactly what was happening, we don't know. But we do know in the very next verse that God said to Noah. Again, a personal encounter with God. Just like Moses goes up on Sinai, God speaks to him. God spoke to Moses. The connection is very real for these Hebrews who are listening to this story, being taught this by Moses. Because unlike the gods of Egypt, they're now worshiping a personal God. And God says to him in verses 13 to 21, I want you to build an ark, and here's how you're going to do it. And we're not going to go into those details. But basically, the guy who had never built a boat before, builds a boat. And you know the joke, right? Professionals built the Titanic, an amateur built the ark. Anyway, so he builds this boat. And then in verse 22, this commentary, that Noah did all that God commanded him to do. He received the instructions and he did it. What was Israel's, ancient Hebrews' biggest problem? They never did everything God told them to do. They were constantly coming up with workarounds or other options. But Noah did as God commanded him to do. Now in chapter 7, The Lord said to Noah. Again, we have God giving direct communication, just like Moses received direct communication. And in chapter 7, we have all the details of the flood coming and they're entering into the ark. And in chapter 7, verse 23, just a single little commentary, only Noah, those who were with him, were left upon the earth. The garden was created. Be fruitful and multiply. And they did that. But in doing that, they propagated sin as much as anything else. And now, all of that is destroyed because God is a righteous God. And in his righteousness, he saves one family, Noah and the animals that were with him. And then we come to the pinnacle of the story. And this is the whole point of the story of Noah and the flood. It's not about how big the ark was. How did the dinosaurs get on? Did the animals go into some sort of hibernation? How did the dragonflies not eat the mosquitoes? I know, there's just all kinds of things that boggle the mind. But chapter 8, verse 1, we have the theological punch. Here's the point of the story. But God remembered Noah and all the beasts and the livestock that were in the ark with him. In fact, that phrase is used repeatedly in the book of Genesis, that God remembered. God remembered Sarah. God remembered Hagar. God remembered Joseph. God remembers people. And the point is, this is not an abstract, self-absorbed deity who is at fight with other deities looking to satiate his own gratifications. That was the gods of Egypt. The God of Israel, the God we worship today, remembers his people because he is a God of righteousness. So we go down to chapter 8, verse 20. The water recedes, Noah gets off the ark, the animals get off the ark, they all scatter. Then verse 20, then Noah built an altar to the Lord and took some of every clean animal and some of every clean bird and offered burnt offerings on the altar. What was central to Israel's time in the wilderness and to becoming a nation together? What was the foundation for that constitution that God established between himself and his people? Was it not the process of offering sacrifices? All kinds of different sacrifices, but here we have Noah offering a sacrifice, just like the Hebrews would, an expression of worship, of gratitude to God. And when the Lord smelled the pleasing aroma, the Lord said in his heart, and I love this, here again, a personal God, a living being, the creator of all things, and he talks to himself. I do that too. In fact, Sharon and I talked about it in the car on the way here. Because I will be doing something downstairs or out in the garage, and she'll open the door and say, hey, blah, 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 blah. And all I hear is me, 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 me. Because I'm busy talking to myself, okay, so I need a brood box. That's got to be 19 3/4 inches this way. But if I turn the board and cut it that way, yeah, hun. And I have absolutely no idea what she has said to me because I've been talking to myself. I know she was there. I acknowledged her. But then I'll come in and it's like, did you? And say, did I what? When did you tell me that? Well, you were at, see, I can do one thing at a time. And if I'm talking to myself, that's the only thing I can do at that time. So, sorry, honey. And she has now learned, after 38 years, how to be very, very patient with me and understands that I don't hear well when I'm concentrating on something else. So when the hammer comes flying, no, I'm just kidding. She does not throw hammers at me. But the Lord smelled the pleasing aroma, and he said in his heart, he talked to himself, I will never again curse the ground that I made because of man. For the intention of man's heart is evil from his youth. Not even I will not strike down again every living creature as I have done. While the earth remains, seed time and harvest and cold and heat and summer and winter and day and night shall not cease. In fact, even though the problem of sin is going to continue, I am going to establish my faithfulness. And the cycles of my created order will always continue. Cold and heat, summer, winter, day and night, Just like I initially established it, I am going to ensure that my creation, my created order continues, even though men will continue their rebellion and dysfunction against me. Because God, being righteous, must also be loving and caring and providential. His righteousness demands that. His love demands that. Then we come to chapter 9, Genesis chapter 9. And God again speaks, and we see something very similar to what happens to the children of Israel as they go into the promised land. And God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth." Where did we see that? In the Garden of Eden. But that's broken. Yet because God is God, and he still loves his creation and still loves all he has created, he continues to bless, even though this now is incapable of being everything that God initially intended it to be because of dysfunction of sin, because of that contamination. Nonetheless, there is a blessing. Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth, going back to the garden type relationship. And then in chapter 9, verse 8, we have these words that are very reminiscent of what God says to Moses on Mount Sinai. God said to Noah and to his sons with him, "Behold, I establish my covenant with you and your offspring after you." I'm going to have a special relationship. This is exactly what established the Hebrews as the Israelites, God's people, because they had a covenant relationship with God through which ultimately the Messiah would come. But before that, God had this covenant with Noah. "And with every living creature that is with you, the birds, the livestock, and every beast of the field or of the earth that is with you, as many that come out of the ark, for it is for every beast of the earth. I will establish my covenant again, that never again shall all the flesh be cut off by the waters of the flood, and never shall there be a flood to destroy the earth." And God said, "This is the sign of the covenant that I will make between me and you and every living thing for all future generations. I have set my bow in the clouds, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth." So as Noah, in his moment of crisis, is saved by God, God provides for him, God remembers him, brings him out of the ark and plants him back on the ground and says, "Be fruitful and multiply." So also the Hebrews are about to go into the promised land. And God says essentially the same thing. "Be fruitful and multiply in this land I'm giving you. I will bless you." And here is the covenant. The difference is it's the covenant that Moses wrote, the law. But it's still a covenantal promise from God. And now in Christ we have a new covenant that reminds us of his faithfulness to Noah, and he remembered Noah, his faithfulness to the children of Israel, he remembered them, his faithfulness to us in sending us Christ. And now we have this new covenant that has displaced all of the old. We live according to the terms of the new covenant, and that's a whole theology we will unpack at another time. We unpacked it little by little. But it speaks to the faithfulness of God because God is a righteous God who remembers his people. "I will remember my covenant," verse 15, "that is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh. And the waters shall never again become a flood to destroy all flesh. When the bow is in the sky, I will see it and remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of all flesh that is on the earth." And God said to Noah, "This is the sign of the covenant that I have established between me and all flesh that is on the earth." Faithfulness of God because he is righteous. So now we come to the end of the story. We're not going to spend a lot of time here, but here's the epilogue. Don't you like whenever you see a story on TV, a news story or a documentary or something, and they tell you about something that happened, then there's a follow-up. Here's what happened 5 years later. Sharon and I like watching Escape to the Country. It streams online. And recently they've started a follow-up series called I Escaped to the Country. So they go back and they visit the people who have moved from the city out to the country in the UK. It's kind of fun to see what's happened since they bought their houses. Well, here's the epilogue to Noah. In verse 20, "Noah began to be a man of the soil and he planted a vineyard." That's understandable. He's not going to become a fisherman, right? That's not a career option. He's had enough time building boats, floating in boats, dealing with stinky stuff in boats. He decides he's going to be a farmer. But because he is blessed, God said, I am going to bless the land. I'm going to bless your efforts. He creates a vineyard and he creates wine. He has a successful harvest. He successfully turns that harvest into wine, and he gets drunk and violates some of the covenant that God had given to the Israelites. But nonetheless, God continues to bless him, and the sons do some thing that boys do, and there's some disobedience there. And yet ultimately, because of that, the one son takes a curse, and from his generation, from his family, become the descendants of Canaan, which are the people living in the land where Israel is going to go in and occupy. So he doesn't end well. He doesn't follow through with that great Noah was blameless in all that he did. But nonetheless, the grace of God is constantly at work in his life. So what is the point of the story? 2 R's: remembrance and righteousness. This is not a debate about tectonic forces or hydraulic forces, or was it global or was it local, or did it even happen and where were the dinosaurs? This is a theology about 2 of God's character qualities that God remembers. God remembers. Because he is a God who observes, he sees, he saw what was happening on the earth. And because he is a righteous God, he responded to that. Because he was a loving God, he could not allow that unrighteousness and injustice to continue. And so he dealt with it. He addressed it. Someday he will do that again. But he does that because he is a personal God who looks and loves his creation, and he remembers those who live upon it. A righteous God must address the problem of evil. But what does that mean for us? How do we respond to him? What does it mean then for us to be righteous as Noah was righteous? 4 summary thoughts about what it is to be righteous. It is not living by rules. Righteousness is not living by a code. Don't smoke, don't chew, don't run around with girls who do. That is not righteousness. Righteousness is a perspective that I recognize that life is lived in the presence of God who sees, who cares, who knows, who provides, and who is engaged. Righteousness is embracing a perspective that my life is lived in the presence of God. This is my Father's world. He sees, he cares. He provides, he is engaged, and because he is both righteous and loving, he will care for me, but he will also deal with unrighteousness, often in a delayed way. But if I am going to live a righteous life, I embrace the truth that I am living in his presence. Nothing is hidden from him. Secondly, not only is life lived in the presence of God, life is lived with God. We walk with God. It's not that he's distant and just up there, but he is also, I will never leave you or abandon you. We walk with him. And although we will struggle with our obedience or disobedience at times, he is still a God who will love us. Yes, there are some moral and ethical values that are non-negotiable. There is no way to get around, thou shalt not murder. There are some absolutes. But most of life is lived in areas where we're making choices where if we're aware that we're living in his presence and we are walking with him, the question we have to answer is, how do I best represent my God in this moment? We recognize life is lived in the presence of God. It is lived with God. And then we recognize the God that we worship is a relational God. And we express personal intimacy with him by reflecting his nature and character, by pursuing, knowing, and growing in the grace and knowledge of the Lord Jesus Christ, and not through attempting to grow in our eloquence in the prayers that we utter or precision in the doctrine we believe. Those things are important, praying and doctrine. But it is not the pursuit of those things that grows righteousness within us. It is understanding that the God we worship is a relational God. And fourth, we recognize that God does care for his creation, and as his image bearers, we too bear a responsibility to care for it, whether that is caring for the green earth he has given to us or for those that live upon it. That's why we're doing Hamilton Food Share today, because it's one way that we can demonstrate that we care for God's creation as God cares for his creation. God remembered Noah because he is righteous and loving. God was gracious to Noah because he remembered him and is righteous and loving. Yet Noah still wrestled with his humanity, as will we. So righteousness is not about becoming perfect. It is about nurturing relationship. When Moses was about to pass the baton off, he left Joshua and that early community of faith with these words: "Therefore choose life, that your offspring may live, loving the Lord your God, obeying his voice and holding fast to him. For he is your life and length of days, that you may dwell in the land the Lord swore to your fathers, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, to give them." But I love the order. Love the Lord your God. And then, because you love, you will obey. There is a role for obedience. It's important. Thou shalt not murder, still thou shalt not murder. But not because we're completing a checklist, but because we have a heart of compassion and love and passion for the God who created us, because we walk with him as Noah walked with God.